Okay. And then I would love to introduce our first speaker. It is my great pleasure to introduce the Executive Director of the Union of Concerned Scientists, Dr. Kathleen Rest. Dr. Rest oversees UCS's programs and operations, drawing on a wealth of experience in government, academia, and the nonprofit sector. She previously served as the Acting Director of the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health in the CDC. Prior to her work in the federal government, Dr. Rest was an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts in the Department of Family and Community Medicine and in the School of Public Health. She was also a founding member of the Association of Occupational and Environmental Clinics, a national nonprofit committed to improving the practice of occupations and environmental health. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kathleen Rest.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you all for attending tonight. It really is my great pleasure to personally welcome and thank you for taking time out of your busy lives to be with us tonight. We had hundreds of people register for this event, and we are really excited that so many people are interested in talking about this really important topic. Now, for those of you who may be new to the Union of Concerned Scientists, we are a national nonprofit founded more than 50 years ago. Our mission is to use rigorous and independent science to solve some of our world's and planet's most pressing problems. We combine technical analysis and effective advocacy to create innovative and practical solutions for a healthy, safe, and sustainable future. We are not a think tank, we are a do tank. And today at UCS, we're a group of, I'd say about 230 people, scientists, analysts, policy and communications experts, all dedicated to this purpose. Now, one of our most pressing problems today is the US's relationship with China. Aggressive rhetoric and policy from both countries has sharply increased in recent years. And yet so much of what we hear and read in the media and from policymakers about China can sometimes be off the mark. So that's why we're holding this event tonight with Dr. Gregory Kulacki, who has been living in China and Japan for over 30 years, working to understand Chinese policies, to promote diplomacy, and build relationships between our two countries. Gregory provides an important and on-the-ground perspective that's often missing in US discussions of some of these issues. So it's great that tonight we can take some time to get back to the basics of the U.S. China relationship, talk a little bit about how we got to this point and what we see as important steps going forward. So it is my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Gregory Kulacki, who's fluent in Mandarin Chinese. As I said, has decades of experience in cross-cultural communication between the US and China. He joined the Union of Concerned Scientists back in 2002 and has since that time been promoting dialogue between experts from both countries on nuclear arms control and space security. And he's consulted with Chinese and US governmental and non-governmental organizations. So I think all of you are looking forward to hearing his perspective and to answer your questions. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Gregory.
Okay, well, thanks Lily and thanks Kathy for the introductions. And hello, and thanks for joining us. I have some slides I'm gonna put up to start. Let's hope all this stuff works. Okay, so I thought I should begin by saying, just a little bit about my personal connections to China and how that informs my, perceptions of what's happening there. Now, I first went to China in 1984 through an exchange program established by Fudan University and the University of Maryland, where I was a graduate student. And one thing I learned during the 2 years I studied there was a difference between the China I learned about in the United States and the China I encountered while I was living there. And I think it's fair to say that in one way or another, I've spent the rest of my life really trying to reconcile that difference. That's probably why I accepted an offer to return to China in 1989 to direct U.S. educational programs at Chinese universities for the Council on International Educational Exchange. And why I stayed in that job for 10 years while building a life in China. Now, I started working for the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2002, as Kathy mentioned, and I continued to spend several months each year in China. And my new job is not that much different than my old one, really. My primary task is to facilitate more effective cross-cultural communication between Chinese and Americans. The only difference, of course, is that instead of talking about education, our conversations are about nuclear weapons and missile defense and space technology. Now, one thing I've learned after 18 years of talking about those topics is that the problem between the United States and China is not the technologies themselves, but what each side fears the other intends to do with them. Both governments seek to use science and technology to cope with their fear of each other. And they're using everything, from satellites to social media. Now, these fears are rooted in our general perceptions of each other. And these perceptions can change, sometimes dramatically. Sudden shifts in US public perceptions of China, like those we can see in this February 2020 graph from Gallup, are usually triggered by unexpected events, like the violent military repression of nationwide Chinese protest in 1989, or this year's global pandemic, which started in a Chinese market. Elite US perceptions of China, like those we can hear in the rhetoric of both of this year's presidential candidates, change more slowly, last longer, and are more consequential. Those perceptions, as reflected in this 2017 survey taken by a group of prominent Chinese Americans, have been steadily moving in a negative direction for quite a while. And my own sense is that they've been moving in that direction since I first started working for UCS in 2002. And I'm worried. I'm really worried that this year's sort of sudden negative shift in US public perceptions of China could lock Americans into a new Cold War-like mentality that could prove very difficult to escape for a very long time. Now, I think we can avoid that if we can find a way to promote constructive dialogue on contentious issues. And one way to help make that possible is for Americans to look just a little more carefully at what's actually happening in China. So I'm really, really delighted that you've decided to join us today. Now, the most important piece of information to keep in mind, which almost every American knows, but routinely overlooks, especially when thinking about the size and state of China's economy, is the size of China's population. The Chinese government is responsible for meeting the needs and expectations of over 1.4 billion people, or close to 1 out of every 5 people on Earth. That's 4 times the population of the United States. Every time I read that China is now a wealthy country and should, as President Obama was fond of saying, bear a greater share of the economic burden for maintaining the international system, I just shake my head and I wonder how they could possibly believe that. Americans often hear how China has the 2nd largest economy in the world and is soon going to overtake the United States. And some economists like Joseph Stiglitz say it already has. But when you take those 1.4 billion people into account, China ranks 73rd among all nations in income and 72nd among all nations in economic production. Both of those indicators are just below the global average and well below the United States and other advanced economies. And even those low per capita figures can minimize the serious economic challenges facing the Chinese leadership. One of the biggest Chinese news stories of 2020, which was barely noticed in the United States, was a report from the premier that revealed that more than 600 million of China's 1.4 billion earn less than 1,000 renminbi, or about $150 per month. So, when you look more critically at China's economy, the idea that China's leaders are buoyed by a sense of newfound wealth that's inflating grand international ambitions to take down the United States, that idea seems suspect. Figuring out how to sustainably provide for the 1/5 of humanity that lives within their borders is likely to occupy the Chinese leadership for a very long time to come. Now, you may ask, and it's a good question, so if that's true, then why is China spending so much money to build up its military? And here too, I think just a little more careful look at the data can be helpful. Now, China's military is certainly much better trained and equipped than it has ever been. And there's no question that China's military capabilities are likely to continue to improve as long as China's economy continues to grow. But describing these developments as a military buildup may distort our perception of what's actually happening. The word buildup creates the impression that they're building up towards something, some planned future military action or goal. And it implies an acceleration or an increase in military spending relative to what Chinese leaders were spending in the past. And it suggests China's leaders have made military spending a higher priority than it was before. That's not what the data shows. Now, the most reliable open source information on global military spending is compiled by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. And it shows the percentage of Chinese government expenditures dedicated to the military has been declining for more than 30 years. It also shows that China held military spending to a more or less constant and comparatively low percentage of its total economic output since 1990. Now, that does not mean that China's steadily improving military capabilities are not a concern. They're a very serious concern, especially to China's neighbors, with whom China has a number of long-standing, centuries-old territorial disputes. And some of China's neighbors are US allies. So their concerns are US concerns. Now, up until relatively recently, the United States enjoyed a clear military advantage over China. But China's steady improvement is eroding that advantage. Given that China has managed to narrow that gap while spending a constant and a comparatively low percentage of its annual GDP on its military, trying to recover that lost US military advantage, which is the current aim of US policy, will be incredibly expensive and is unlikely to succeed. And it's unlikely to succeed because China does not need to arms race to continue to narrow the gap. As long as its economy continues to grow, it can continue with its current spending pattern. But the United States will almost certainly incur very large new costs in the process of trying to recover its former military advantage over China. And even if the United States were to pay those costs, as long as these centuries-old territorial disputes remain unresolved, they're going to be an ever-present source of tension and potential triggers for military conflict. So it might be wiser, and it would certainly be much cheaper for the United States to more actively pursue diplomatic solutions to those disputes. There has been so little interest and even less investment in diplomacy. You know, the potential for success could be much greater than we currently imagine it to be. Now, there are many reasons why the United States does not invest more in diplomacy. But when it comes to China in 2020, the main obstacle seems to be a very clear shift in US elite perceptions of the efficacy of negotiating with a communist Chinese government that appears to be far less open to US elite opinions and influence than it used to be. And this shift is accompanied by accelerating US efforts to decouple our economies and societies, and to put up barriers to the flow of trade and technology, information, and people. Now, if these trends continue, the United States could find itself in a situation very similar to the 1950s and 1960s, when it refused to recognize the legitimacy of China's communist government, considered it an implacable enemy, and fought the two largest anti-communist military conflicts of the Cold War in Korea and Vietnam. I'm not an admirer of Richard Nixon or Henry Kissinger. When they went to China in 1972, the country was still in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, which by all accounts was the darkest period in China's modern history. So dark and so unflattering to the Chinese Communist Party that the entire decade from 1966 to 1976 has been virtually scrubbed from Chinese history books. On principle, Nixon should not have gone. But because Nixon did go to China, he made it possible for ordinary Americans and Chinese to resume normal relations, to travel, to study, and to trade. And the net effect on Chinese society and culture, as well as the Chinese economy, has been overwhelmingly positive. The United States and China's neighbors have benefited from those changes as well, and so have I. US elites came to believe that those economic, social, and cultural changes would also change Chinese politics. They argued that China's leaders would eventually have to choose between continued economic success or their allegiance to communist ideology and organization. In other words, US elites believed that China couldn't be rich and communist at the same time, at least not for very long. US political elites repeatedly expressed confidence in the inevitability of political change in China. And they did that even after the Chinese communist leadership brutally repressed nationwide demonstrations in the spring of 1989. US corporations accepted onerous Chinese demands on the transfer of US technologies in exchange for access to Chinese markets, betting that they could renegotiate those deals after that political change everybody was waiting for happened. And it's only now that US elites are finally giving up on that theory. And that, more than any other single factor, is responsible for the negative shift in US elite attitudes towards China that we're experiencing now. I think the most important question about China Americans are facing as they head into the 2020 election is whether they should respond to this perceived US elite failure to change China's political system by severing the relationships established in the wake of Nixon's visit and returning to the more confrontational policies of the Cold War era. I don't think that's necessary. I think that would be unwise. And with that recommendation, I'll close my formal presentation and I look forward to taking your questions.
Great, thank you so much, Gregory. So as I mentioned before, we received over 100 questions in advance, so we're going to put forward some of those questions, but we will also be posing some of the ones that we're seeing come in the chat right now. So please do feel free to keep those coming. One quick clarifying question that I thought would be helpful that came up was, before we jump into some other topics, was Gregory, could you define US elites, which you used in your presentation?
You know, journalists, business people, politicians.
Okay, great. So there were some definite themes that we saw come through in the questions in advance. One of the most common was on human rights and especially the treatment of Uyghurs and the Muslim population in China as a whole. So Gregory, my first question to you is, can you comment on this and share your perspective on the situation?
Yeah. So, you know, it's really, really difficult for me to comment on the question of human rights in China, especially in a public forum like this that's being recorded and is going to be posted on the internet, because it could compromise my ability to do my job. But, you know, as a staff member of an organization that's trying to be more active, more forward on questions of justice and equity and diversity and inclusiveness, you know, both internally and externally, I don't see how I can avoid it. So, when discussing the gross violations of human rights that are happening in China, I think the first thing, the most important thing you have to say is that there is no justification for it. None. No matter what the political or sociological or historical circumstances might be, and no matter how difficult China's economic problems or governance problems are, there's no justification for it. The way some groups like Tibetans, Chinese Muslims, because this has gone way beyond one ethnicity, Chinese Buddhists, Chinese Christians, as well as certain individuals like the democratic activists in Hong Kong, or Chinese academics who've had the temerity to question the decisions of the current leadership. The way these people are being treated it's abhorrent. It's shameful. And it's a violation of international law. Calling attention to those injustices is important. It's a source of solace and a hope and purpose. It gives that to the victims, and I think it's a prerequisite for change. You know, and I think in the end, it could possibly lead the Chinese Communist leadership to reconsider their position on civil and political rights. There was a poll, I think it's a very recent poll from Pew Global, that showed overwhelming numbers of people have very strong negative opinions of the Chinese communist leadership. And given a lot of the other good things they're doing on climate and energy, for example, in the world, that's definitely, those negative views are definitely tied to the human rights situation in Xinjiang and in Tibet and in Hong Kong. I think the possibility of constructive change would be greater if we could get rid of this notion that there's some sort of grand historical contest going on between the United States and China, and shift that conversation into a more cooperative context. The context in which the Charter of the United Nations was written, where those international covenants on human rights abide.
Great, thank you. Another theme that we saw in the questions was climate change. And so my second question is, how can the US and China work together on climate change? And where do you see China's policy on climate and the environment going in the coming years? One also recent question that we just got in the chat kind of on this as well is, do you think China is going to become one of our best hopes for environmental survival?
Well, climate's not my part of the store, as they say. But I did talk to my colleagues who are very familiar with what's happening in China on climate to help me out here. So I think by far the most important announcement in 2020 was in September at the UN General Assembly, where it was in September, I think, where they said they'd aim for carbon neutrality by 2060. Whether they can meet that target is an open question, and the details are pretty fuzzy. But yeah, I mean, if the Chinese leadership can find a way to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, the early estimates from things like the Climate Action Tracker say that this would lower global warming projections by 0.2 to 0.3 degrees Celsius. And that's a big deal, pretty big deal. There's also some hope that China and the European Union are going to come together and create this sort of coalition of high purpose or ambition on climate in the lead up to the next UN climate conference. The thing to watch, of course, is whether or not China makes a really concerted move to move away from coal, both within the country and in terms of its financing of international energy projects. On the domestic side, things look pretty encouraging. And there's a lot of pressure because of local air pollution from continued use of coal. On the international side, the signs are not pointing in the right direction, at least not yet. The sincerity of that commitment will be a lot clearer in a few months when China publishes its 5-year plan for the economy in the early part of next year. And we'll see where its priorities are. One thing that does seem pretty clear, at least to me, is that they've been investing in clean transportation, heavily in clean transportation, particularly in the development of an electric vehicles industry. And the scale of that effort is huge. If it's successful, it could transform the industry, just like it did with solar panels. Another thing to think about is that I think the Chinese Communist Party leadership sees the struggle against climate as a struggle for its own survival. If it doesn't solve that problem, it's not going to survive. They have to face some really significant climate impacts, and they're getting worse, as we know, everywhere, all the time. You know, another big unreported story 2020 are the floods, the massive floods, barely noticed in the United States, in China this year. China's also facing some horrific water shortage, long-term water shortage questions. So I think they see this as necessary. So I think they'll be committed to it because their own necks are on the line. They're investing a lot in climate science. They're also investing a lot in climate, in environmental education, conservation and protection. If you have a chance to watch Chinese language television stations that broadcast live on the internet, you can get a firsthand look at that campaign, which is massive and extensive. And, you know, a lot of the messaging, even if you don't understand what they're saying, is very compelling. I have an old friend who works in the upper levels of the Environmental Protection Ministry. He does environmental education. And according to him, at least, you know, there's some very encouraging information on the fact that that campaign, which has been going on for a long time now, has been very effective in terms of changing attitudes and behavior, especially among young people. Because climate change is connected to the survival of the party, I think no matter what happens with the United States, China is going to continue to, you know, push green technology. But pooling our resources would be a lot better. Cooperation would be a lot better. And that can only happen if we get rid of this idea that we should be competing on climate change and green technology to gain some sort of political or economic advantage. We really should be working together, and change will be faster and better.
Thank you. So something we've seen quite a few questions about is around the One Belt, One Road philosophy or policy. And so could you discuss this? One kind of nuance to this question that came in was, if China is still a developing country with domestic needs, how can it afford that policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's not a question of affording it. They're making money off of it. So I think that's an important thing. Trade, benefits, economic growth. You know, my personal experience of the Belt and Road project was being able to buy this nice 250 milliliter carton of, you know, delicious Polish yogurt in a little dinky little convenience store in the town where my in-laws live. Because that's basically what this is about. Railroads that connect Europe to China make, you know, and it was 45 cents, you know, make it available for that Polish yogurt to be there. That's really what the Belt and Road Project is about. You know, China's doing abroad what it was so successful at doing at home, which is building infrastructure. It's one of the best things they do. And basically, they're just recreating these old silk trade routes that used to exist to Europe, to Africa, and to Asia by land and by sea as well. I know you probably heard a lot about the ports that they're building. So, I mean, they're hoping that that kind of infrastructure investment is going to create the same economic benefits abroad, that which will be good for China as it created at home.
Great. So we've also gotten a number of questions around China being more assertive in its surrounding with regard to Southeast Asian countries. Does the U.S. have a role in supporting China's neighbors against Chinese growing assertiveness? And I think kind of in a similar vein, it says, Jean asked, the U.S. is being very provocative in the South China Sea. Can you discuss the implications of this?
Well, geez. The South China Sea situation has been contentious for a long time. And I think the thing that those claims have been around for forever. China's more capable of pursuing its interests now. But they're not the only ones that are occupying islands. The Vietnamese occupied islands in the 70s, the Philippines occupied island, the Malays. I mean, they're all arguing over the same thing. And really, the most important thing that's going on there is a fight over fish. This is a fight about fish. It's one of the world's most productive fisheries. And this rising consumer class in China of 1.4 billion people, even marginal increases in their ability to buy fish is driving the tensions and competitions, at least as I see it. The United States, if the United States had a cooperative relationship with China, if we didn't have this idea of some grand historical competition, great power competition, whatever, if that weren't there, then I think the United States could much more effectively participate in sort of mediating some of these disputes. But as long as we have that narrative, as long as that's the way we define things, then China is going to see everything we say and do on the South China Sea as part of this larger war. which of course is going to make it more and more difficult to solve any of the practical problems, the real practical problems like managing the fishery. That's the most important thing to get done there.
All right, some questions we got in advance and then I'm seeing in the chat are around China and Africa. So what is the shape of the conflict in Africa between China and America? And also someone noted that this is one of the great decisions in 2021 topics.
So Africa, you know, people have to realize, they have to remember, or at least study if you're a young person, that the relationship between China and Africa is not something new at all. China's got its seat in the United Nations in 1971 because of the votes of newly independent African states in the UN General Assembly. And that bond has been there ever since. When I was directing study abroad programs back in China, especially in Nanjing, the universities were flooded with full scholarship African students. And they weren't there like my students studying language or history or culture. They were there studying hydrology and mechanical engineering and electrical engineering. And those people are now populating the bureaucracies of African governments. And so the human investment and the political connections between China and Africa are now allowing, in the wake of China having this Belt and Road Initiative where it's going to be doing investments in infrastructure, that's really starting to take off in Africa. And you can see the results of the benefits of the creation of infrastructure in the, you know, improving economic prospects in Africa. So I see that more as a positive thing than a negative thing. I think there has been a lot of pushback from African governments, and in our summer symposiums where we have participants from African countries, we hear this. The Chinese have been kind of heavy-handed and they bring their own workers, but they're working that stuff out slowly. You know, there's always tension and there's always conflict when you have this sort of cultural interaction, especially as the scale increases. But by and large, I mean, I personally see it as a pretty positive thing, and I think the United States can find better ways to participate in what's going on there than to see it again as part of some winner-take-all competition, like Africa's either ours or yours. It's neither. It's the Africans' place, and it's up to them to decide who they want to work with and who they want to cooperate with. And for the moment, because of these long-standing ties, a lot of them are deciding to cooperate with the Chinese.
Great, Gregory, sorry, this is going back a little bit, but someone commented on your response about the South China Sea. I thought maybe I'd bring this back, have a bit of a discussion here. Doug says maybe it's too simplistic to say that the South China Sea is just about fish. There's huge subsea energy resources, control of the major shipping lanes, et cetera. So I wonder if you can comment on his comment there.
Well, that's a good point. And that's true. Those things are factors. But the tensions, if you follow the narrative in the newspaper and in the history, the fights are always about fish. This latest round, when things got started to get out of hand, was when the Chinese trapped these Philippine fishermen in an atoll and wouldn't let them out, or the other way around. I can't remember. But these kind of fights go on all the time. So those things, I think, are part of it. But fish is a big driver. At least from my point of view. The sea lanes thing, I think, is a myth. China's not interfering with any commercial shipping. It would be foolish for it to do so. You know, everybody in that region of the world is dependent upon those sea lanes staying open, and China has no interest in closing them off or making anybody feel threatened. The problem is this. The problem is the US military wants to sail wherever it wants. And China's definition of what its territorial waters are and the international definition of what its territorial waters are different. Plus, the United States isn't a member of the Law of the Sea Treaty, but that's another issue. And what China's protesting about are military vessels, the freedom of navigation especially for US military vessels. So the contest between the United States and China in the South China Sea is about that. China has not interfered with, you know, commercial sea traffic. And I would be really shocked and surprised if we started to see incidents where China was threatening commercial shipping.
Right, this is also going back a little, I think, in part to human rights, but I've seen a couple questions on this around Hong Kong. So why did China take over Hong Kong at this particular time is one question. And then another piece of this, do you feel that the crackdown on political opposition in Hong Kong indicates that Chinese leaders have given up on reunification with Taiwan?
Well, they'll never give up on reunification of Taiwan. That's something we need to worry about. Hong Kong was given back to China. The British took it in 1840 in the Opium War, in perpetuity, by the way. And let me tell you a story about Hong Kong, the personal one. Hong Kong is really important to me. I have a really strong emotional attachment to Hong Kong. When I first went to China in 1984, I was a poor middle-class boy from Baltimore who'd never been west of the Mississippi, and I ended up landing in Hong Kong. It was my first stop, and I was lucky enough to be hosted by this architect, and I was living in a posh condo in Midtown, and we were having breakfast with croissants and silver every morning in the Mandarin Orient Hotel. I was going out on his yacht. I was with his family. I was eating, seeing all this stuff over Hong Kong. He really he's a great host and a wonderful person. And this was in 1984 in August. And he was very worried then about what was going to happen with the mainland communist Chinese in Hong Kong. Margaret Thatcher went to Beijing, talked to Deng Xiaoping in September, a month after I was in Hong Kong, but he already knew in August that a deal had been struck. And the deal was basically that the UK was going to turn it back in 1984. It didn't happen until 1997, but the deal was made then. And the terms of the deal were made then. So it's not that they're taking it over, it's that the British gave it back. And he was terrified. He was angry. And he really thought that the Chinese communists were going to wreck the place. And that left a really deep impression on me. I've been to Hong Kong a lot. I was there in 2014 for the umbrella protests, and everybody was pretty hopeful. And even after the transition in 97, Hong Kong had pretty much kept its identity. I've written a few blog posts about it if you want to take a look. I was also there this fall at the height of the demonstrations, and nobody was hopeful then. Everybody I talked to, the student leaders, the students who were opposed to the protest, the academics, the business leaders, everybody knew what was coming. And so the imposition of this security law unilaterally by Beijing was not a surprise to anybody. My biggest worry, I love the place, is what the effect of this on the education system. Because education systems everywhere are how a culture and identity is transmitted from one generation to the next. And this security law could wreck. I mean, it could just totally change the Hong Kong education system. It's my biggest worry.
I see some more questions about Taiwan in the chat. I want to get to some other topics in our last few minutes, but I would just note that Gregory just completed a series of blog posts on Taiwan, and we'll be sending that out also afterwards, and that's a great place to look for more. And also feel free to follow up with Gregory after this in that follow-up email. So one question here is, should the US be nervous about China's nuclear weapons program?
Well, yeah. I mean, anytime anybody's got nuclear weapons that are targeting your population, you should definitely be worried about it. Absolutely. That's why we do the work we do. China's arsenal is a lot smaller than the US arsenal. They keep it off alert, which means that it's not like ready to go in 15 minutes. They have a retaliation only policy. So if we don't use them first, they say they won't use them first. The warheads are kept made. The warheads aren't even on the missiles for most of them. They're separated, and they ride around and are hidden and buried in trucks, in tunnels and mountains in China. The biggest danger is that if there's some sort of conventional war, between the United States and China. The United States policy is to use nuclear weapons first. We have these so-called low-yield nuclear weapons that everybody imagines we can use and somehow not trigger a Chinese retaliatory response. The Chinese have promised whatever size nuclear weapon you use, we're going to retaliate. So I think the best thing we can do is to make sure our government does not have a policy of first use and abandons this effort to build these new low-yield nuclear weapons. And I think that will go a long way towards minimizing the damage or the threat that China's nuclear arsenal poses to not only the United States, but also to our allies in Asia.
All right, another question we have here is, how do you feel about China's investment in nuclear power generation?
Yeah, nuclear power. You know, the nuclear power, people that believe in nuclear power really believe in nuclear power. And there's certainly a community of nuclear engineers in China who have that faith, you know, that it's just going to be the thing. And that drives a lot of the reporting in the United States about what's happening in China's policy, because they often quote these you know, sort of the nuclear industry, nuclear engineers in China. But it's only 5% as of this year of their total electric generation. They have about somewhere around 50 plants in operation. I think they've got another 10 to 12 under construction. There's talk about a lot of you know, rapid buildup or something, but that all got killed after Fukushima. There was a huge Chinese public reaction. People were buying salt tablets and mass, and you know, after Fukushima, and that really put the brakes on a planned rollout of large-scale nuclear power construction in China. And they haven't changed their policy on that. So they're, you know, proceeding incrementally. They're still attached to reprocessing and a closed fuse cycle, which, you know, again, you know, the nuclear folks just believe that someday, sometime, we don't think that's wise, of course, at UCS for them to be doing that, because reprocessing has a lot of negative consequences. So. And they're doing that even though they don't have a, you know, they don't have a waste disposal problem yet, because their nuclear industry is very young, and they still have plenty of ability to store. So.
So some questions I'm getting are about technology. And so as I'm trying to kind of merge a couple of questions here, is Chinese technology generally ahead of Western countries? We keep hearing about the theft of technology from the U.S. to China. And is this happening, and to what degree?
So theft is definitely going on. I mean, but that's been going on from time immemorial. I mean, the Germans were stealing, you know, British sewing machine designs. It goes on forever. So yeah, and with the internet age and the fact that data is available electronically, there's as much as they can steal, they're stealing. But we gave a lot of it away. When the US corporations wanted to go into China, the Chinese government said, okay, but you got to transfer your technology to us. That's the deal. And we did it. Our corporations did it. Now they're trying to get out of it. So yes, large scale stealing is definitely going on, but US corporations, you know, ceded the Chinese science and technology voluntarily. So I think that's important to keep in mind. In terms of whether they're more advanced in the United States or not, depends on which technologies you're talking about. Space technology, no. I mean, what China's doing right now in space is what the United States were doing in the 1960s and 70s. I mean, you know, they're going to put up a space station, which is going to be kind of like Skylab was. So, and their sensors on their satellites are not as good as you know, they're behind. Getting better, closing the gap, as it were, but still behind. In AI, that's a different story. China has a history of loving to collect data, lots of data, and they're very good at it. They have control, complete control, the government does, over their internet infrastructure. I mean, the United States government watches what goes on and then can search in it and pick out things and use it in nefarious ways, but the Chinese government is actively managing, for all kinds of purposes, good and bad, every bit of information that flows between every single individual in China. That has kind of nightmarish consequences for politics. It dramatically narrows the space for free speech and free association. But China's government is also using it in really positive ways. For example, in poverty relief, they've made big gains in the last decade. And one of the reasons is the application of AI technology. They used to send cash down through the bureaucracy. And of course, everybody took their piece of it before it got to the poor person at the end of the line. Now it goes straight to that person at the end of the line's cell phone. And the local cadres in the villages are being asked questions about why does this family and this family and that family, why aren't they doing economically well? What are you doing about it to fix it? So I'll give you another example, which is more mundane, but just as interesting. My brother-in-law is like one of the worst drivers in the world, and he was always speeding and getting tickets and being reckless. But now they have cameras that are mounted on all the highways, and those cameras are linked to a system that's connected to his employer and connected to his bank account. And he's speeding on the highway, and before he gets past the sensor, they've notified his employer and taken the fine out of his bank account, which has had an impact on traffic fatalities. So they're using it. They're really, I think they're much further ahead because of the amount of control they have on what they're doing with AI. So again, it depends upon the technology that you're talking about.
All right, so we have a question here that rising tensions between the US and China has also affected Chinese scientists working in the US as well as American scientists collaborating in China. So, that's resulted in a crackdown on US-Chinese scientific collaborations. What can US academics and scientists with relationships in China do to help reduce tensions and maintain dialogue? And then I'll also ask, what about those of us outside of academia and science?
Yeah, every time there's an uptick in tensions between the US and China, I've watched this my whole life, there's an uptick in persecution. Of academics and scholars. So the first thing I think we need to do is to support your Chinese American colleagues and your Chinese American students. The second thing we can do is to fight to keep these exchange programs open. Don't let them get shut down. And the last thing, I guess, is to weigh in with Congress. Let them know that you care about this and that you want to maintain these normal channels that people can go through, educational channels and scientific research cooperation channels. You want those things maintained. Whatever the grand politics between China and the United States are, we've got to find a way for normal, ordinary people to be able to continue to travel and study and trade with each other.
All right, and I think that leaves us time for just one last question. So what are 3 policy changes the US should make to pursue a better path with US-China policy?
Get rid of this great power competition narrative. That's one. Value diplomacy over military threats. That's 2. And the third is, learn more. Listen before you speak. Have more respectful and patient interactions with your Chinese colleagues. Those are the 3 things. I think that would be it.
All right. Well, we have gotten so many great questions, and it has really been wonderful to see this level of engagement on this issue. We appreciate everyone joining us so much. A huge thank you to Dr. Gregory Kulacki and Dr. Kathleen Rest for making remarks today.
Thank you.
We will be sending out, as I said, a follow-up email. It'll have some other ways that you can engage on this issue by following what UCS and Gregory are putting out, by spreading more information on social media, and by following up with Gregory on any questions that you didn't get answered today or anything you'd like to talk about further. So with that, I think that wraps up, and thanks again for joining us on a Tuesday evening. We really appreciate it.